The wind was screaming at 4,000 feet. Mark reached for the next handhold, but his fingers didn't hit cold granite. They hit glass. A perfectly clean, modern window, bolted into a cliff face that shouldn't have been touched for 1,000,000 years. His climbing partner looked up, his face turning pale. "Mark," he whispered. "There's a light on inside." They were suspended over a 1,000-foot drop, staring into a room that didn't exist on any map. But what they saw when they finally pressed their faces against the glass was something no one was ready for. The north face of the Black Spire is a vertical graveyard. Mark and Leo had been climbing for 6 hours, battling a biting wind that threatened to peel them off the rock. They were seasoned pros, used to the isolation of the high peaks. But as Mark reached for a standard crimp grip, his hand slipped across a surface that felt wrong. It wasn't the jagged texture of ancient granite. It was smooth. It was cold. He wiped away a layer of frost and froze. Beneath the ice was a sheet of glass, perfectly inset into the mountain. There were no seams, no bolts, and no signs of drilling. It looked as if the mountain had simply grown around it. Leo swung over, his breathing heavy in the thin air. "Is that a window?" he gasped, his voice cracking. They looked down, a 2,000-foot drop to the valley floor. They looked up, another 1,000 feet of untouched lethal summit. There were no trails, no cables, and no logical way for a construction crew to reach this spot. Even a helicopter would have been shredded by the erratic thermal winds. Mark pressed his gloved hand against the pane. It was warm, vibrating with a low, rhythmic hum that he could feel in his teeth. He pulled his goggles up, squinting through the dark tint of the glass. Deep inside the mountain, something was glowing. It wasn't the flickering of a fire or the harsh buzz of an industrial bulb. It was a soft, pulsating amber light. And then, Leo pointed to the corner of the frame. There, etched into the glass in a language they didn't recognize, was a date. A date from 3 years in the future. But that wasn't the part that made Mark's heart stop. That was when he heard it. A faint, muffled sound coming from the other side of the glass. Someone was knocking back. Mark froze, his nut tool hovering inches from the glass. The knocking didn't stop. It was frantic, a rhythmic, the heavy pounding that seemed to sync perfectly with his own racing heartbeat. "Mark, get away from it!" Leo yelled, his voice cracking with pure adrenaline. But Mark couldn't move. He was mesmerized by the warmth radiating from the pane, a heat that felt impossible in the sub-zero altitude. He used his sleeve to buff a small clear circle in the center of the window. The amber light flooded his vision, revealing a room that defied every law of logic. It looked like a high-end hotel suite, carved directly into the heart of the mountain peak. There was a bed, a plush rug, and a television flickering with gray silent static. But as he scanned the walls, his blood turned to ice. There were no doors, no vents, no way in or out, just a luxury tomb of solid stone. "That's when everything changed," Mark whispered, and his eyes locking onto a small table near the glass. On the table sat a silver frame. Inside was a photograph. It showed 2 climbers, dressed in the exact same neon orange gear they were wearing right now. But in the photo, their ropes were severed, trailing uselessly into the clouds. "Leo," Mark gasped. "Look at the date on the frame." It was today's date, and the timestamp on the bottom was only 3 minutes away. He immediately stepped back, his boots scraping for purchase on the narrow, crumbling ledge. Something wasn't right. The mountain beneath them began to groan. It wasn't the sound of shifting snow or cracking ice. It was the deep, mechanical hum of heavy machinery. The window didn't just sit in the rock. It was part of a massive, hidden mechanism shifting inside the peak. And then, they heard the sharp hiss of pressurized air. Then the window wasn't a window at all. It was a hatch, and it was starting to swing outward right into the space where they were hanging. The heavy glass panel didn't just open, it lunged. Mark gasped as the hatch slammed into his shoulder, nearly bucking him off the vertical wall. He swung wildly, his boots kicking at nothing but empty air and a 1,000-foot drop. "Hold on!" Leo screamed, his knuckles white as he gripped his own safety line. But the room they were looking at was changing. The warm amber light flickered and died, replaced by a sterile surgical blue. The luxury furniture, the bed, the rug, the table began to dissolve. It wasn't wood or fabric. It was a projection, a digital skin peeling away to reveal a cold, metallic interior. Mark's eyes darted back to the silver frame on the table, and the photo of their severed ropes wasn't a warning anymore. It was a live feed. The camera angle was from directly behind them, floating in the open air where nothing should be. "Mark! The anchors!" Leo's voice was a jagged edge of pure panic. Mark looked up at the rock face where their life-saving metal bolts were hammered in. The granite was rippling like water. The mountain was literally swallowing the anchors, drawing the metal deep into the stone. Their ropes were being pulled inward, shortening by the second, dragging them toward the open hatch. It wasn't a rescue. It was a harvest. A low, distorted voice began to broadcast from the walls of the chamber. It wasn't a stranger's voice. It was Mark's own voice, playing back a conversation he'd had with his wife the night before they left. A conversation he had never recorded. The mechanical hum grew into a deafening roar, shaking the very core of the mountain. As the ropes tightened, pulling them through the threshold of the hatch, the blue light shifted one last time. In the center of the dark metallic floor, a shape began to rise. And then, they saw it. The shape rising from the dark floor was a sleek white sarcophagus. It hissed as the seal broke, releasing a cloud of freezing vapor that smelled like ozone and old snow. Leo scrambled backward, his boots sliding on the polished metal floor. "Don't look!" Leo choked out, his voice trembling with a primal fear. But Mark couldn't look away. Inside the pod wasn't a body from the past. It was a perfect biomechanical replica of Mark himself. The skin was flawless, the gear was identical. Even the small scar on his chin from a childhood fall was perfectly placed. But the eyes were wide open, glowing with that same pulsating amber light. The chamber began to hum, a deep vibration that felt like a frequency being tuned to the core of the earth. Suddenly, the metallic walls didn't just glow, they vanished. For a split second, Mark thought he was falling into the abyss, but he wasn't. The mountain had become transparent. He could see miles of glowing circuitry snaking through the rock like a massive nervous system. The Black Spire wasn't a natural landmark. It was a sentinel, a geological observer placed here before the first human ever walked the earth. And now, it was finished with its current data set. The replica in the pod reached out its hand, its movements fluid and hauntingly human. It wasn't trying to attack. It was waiting for the transfer. Mark felt a sharp, cold pull at the back of his mind, like a memory being deleted. He looked at Leo, whose own replica was already standing behind him, a hand resting gently on his shoulder. The true horror wasn't what was hidden inside the mountain. It was the realization that the world below would never even know they were gone. "We aren't the first ones," Mark whispered, his identity slipping away into the hum. "And we won't be the last." 2 hours later, two figures descended into base camp. They moved with a rhythmic precision that shouldn't be possible after 12 hours on a vertical wall. Mark's wife ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck. He hugged her back, but his skin felt like a heat lamp, perfectly, unnervingly warm. When he spoke, his voice was a flawless recreation, yet it lacked the jagged edge of exhaustion. "We saw things up there," he told the cameras, smiling with teeth that were now perfectly straight. "Things that changed us forever." The footage from their headcams was reviewed by experts for weeks. It showed nothing but clouds, rock, and the standard struggle of a high-altitude climb. The window, the light, the chamber. It had all been edited out in real time by a signal no one could detect. The black spire returned to its silent vigil. Geologists poked at the rock but found only granite and quartz. The mountain hadn't just hidden the evidence, it had digested it. Now, Mark and Leo live among us. They are better husbands, better friends, better employees. They never tire. They never complain. They never forget a detail. But sometimes, in the dead of night, they stand perfectly still by the window. They stare up at the peaks, their eyes pulsing with a faint amber light, waiting for the mountain to call its data home. The climbers didn't find a secret at the top of the world. The secret found them. And now, it's walking down your street. Sometimes, the mountain doesn't want to be climbed. It wants to be heard. That's all for today. Subscribe if you love real mysteries that feel stranger than fiction.